What we're going to do is look at Eastern Europe, and again we're going to kind of pick up with what was going on by 1200, run 1200 through 1450, then the early modern period, and up to 1900. So what we're looking at here really is the Byzantine Empire and Russia. Though, to simplify it for a world history context, that's the big picture for Eastern Europe. So as you're filling in the Eastern Europe chart and as you're taking quizzes and self-checks on Eastern Europe, that's your focus. The Byzantine Empire, and then we've got Russia. And so let's jump to the Byzantine Empire, because by 1200, the Byzantine Empire had been in existence for centuries. So this is really the Eastern Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, we call the Western Roman Empire, the Roman Empire usually. The Roman Empire had fallen in 476, and we talked about how that was a severe collapse. And so that for a lot of students, that's the end of that. There's no more Rome. But the Byzantine Empire and the emperors that ruled it considered themselves to be Roman. And so this eastern part of the empire, governed from Constantinople, continues to exist until 1453. And then we're going to look at an area that is strongly influenced by the Byzantine Empire, which is Kievan Rus, the early version of Russia. And so we'll go back a little bit. When we start with the Byzantine Empire, a lot of historians start with Justinian. So Justinian was emperor in the 500 CE. So we're going back quite a bit here. But the reason we do is that Justinian is often considered to be the model of a Byzantine emperor. He is absolute. Power is centralized in the hands of the emperor. From the time of Justinian, there was a quality bureaucracy where the emperor was appointing officials that would carry out his commands. As a result of the Arab conquests of parts of the Middle East in the 600s and 700s, the Byzantines have to figure out ways to rule their territory a little bit better, and the bureaucracy becomes much improved as a result of that. So if we kind of fast forward to closer to 1200, by the time we get to 1200, Byzantine emperors are at the heart of what we could even consider a civil service bureaucracy. It is a bureaucracy at the level of that we would find in China. It's a very highly centralized system. Byzantine emperors were claiming legitimacy that was based on Roman tradition in one way, right? So Justinian famously codifies Roman laws. So he is looking back to earlier Roman traditions, claiming to be a Roman emperor. And Justinian, on top of that, is legitimizing himself as the head of the religion, as the leader of the church in the eastern part of Europe. And so you can see there in the bottom left the picture of Jesus. And so in Western Europe, the emphasis is on pictures of Jesus suffering, Jesus on the cross. Pictures of Jesus in the Byzantine Empire tend to focus on Jesus as an authority figure. So by extension, the emperor is the authority figure. Jesus is holding the Bible, so Jesus is judging according to the law. And by extension, the emperor is going to judge you according to the law. And so the Byzantine emperors then are more powerful in a lot of ways as a result of this Christian influence than earlier Roman emperors had been. So the capital you can see there on the right is Constantinople. That's the Golden Horn. So it's on this peninsula. And that peninsula made it very easy to defend. It also meant that they could regulate trade coming through the Bosporus Strait. So look how narrow the Bosporus Strait is. And people can swim across the Bosporus Strait. So that enabled the Byzantines to close down that trade whenever they felt like they needed to. And then if you look at the map on the left-hand side, that's how narrow the strait is going from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So Constantinople controlled that east-west trade. And so this is the other thing we want to see about the Byzantine Empire, is that it is one of the wealthy empires in the world at this time. If we look at the manufacturing centers around the world in 1200, the most productive, wealthiest of those would be found in the Caliphate, the Middle East, would be found in China. The Sung dynasty would be found in the Indian states of the day and in the Byzantine Empire. They would have produced silk. They would have regulated the flow of Chinese goods coming across the Silk Road into the Mediterranean. And so not only do we have centralization over the political structures, the Byzantines also exercised a great deal of control over merchants and trade regulations as well. And so for a while, they are virtually without rival in the Mediterranean. And the Arabs are able to challenge them slightly, but to a large degree, it's the Byzantine Empire that's dominating trade in that region. All right, now in 1056, we have a break in Christianity where we end up with two forms of Christianity, two major forms. Now, there are other forms as well, but the two major forms in Europe are Catholic Christianity in the West and Orthodox Christianity in the East. Now, there aren't major doctrinal differences between the two, even to this day, and especially in 1000, that was true. The differences were mainly geographic or related to authority. In the East, they spoke Greek in the liturgy, and they looked to the emperor or the patriarch of Constantinople as the leader. In the West, they used Latin as the language of the religion, and they looked to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as the leader. And so as time goes on, the geographic differences are what pull the churches apart more than anything else. And there's the dispute over icons, but that kind of comes and goes. It's not a persistent doctrinal difference. So after 1056, what that means is that the Christians in Europe are going to begin to go their separate ways. And so at first, there is going to be an effort made to rejoin the two churches. And to some degree, the Crusades were an effort to bring the two churches back together. But as time goes on, the Western Christians are going to go their way, and the Orthodox Christians are going to go a different way. And so that is going to mean, by the time we get to about 1450, that the Byzantine Empire is isolated from potential Christian allies. And so when those potential Christian allies become not just doctrinally different than Constantinople, but also trade rivals, then this is going to be bad news. As a result of the wealth and the position of Constantinople, the influence that the Byzantines have on Eastern Europe, the rest of Eastern Europe, is similar to what we would see with China and places like Japan and Korea. It's the wealthy, more sophisticated, more established civilization that is going to influence the culture and political system and economics of a newer civilization. So Kievan Rus is established in what's today Ukraine and Russia, and Belarus as well. We could think of it as an early Russian state. So what happens, we have Slavic groups that were inhabiting that area already, and then we have Scandinavians, Vikings, that come into the area as raiders, but also looking for farmland. And those two mix, they form this Russian population. So you can see on the map the river system in the middle map on the bottom, linking Kievan Rus to Constantinople. And so this is going to be a conduit for trade. It's also going to allow missionaries from the Byzantine Empire to work their way up to Kievan Rus. And so the cities of Kievan Rus, like Kiev and Novgorod, are going to become Orthodox in their practice of Christianity. They are going to imitate Byzantine architectural forms. The writing system, Cyrillic, is based on the Greek alphabet, modified for Slavic languages. But just as we saw with places like Korea and Japan in relation to China, Kievan Rus is not going to be able to imitate the centralized political forms of the Byzantines. They don't have the money, they don't have the level of education in order to do so. And so you're going to have a good deal of cultural imitation, but much less political imitation, in spite of the fact that the kings of Kievan Rus would have liked nothing more than to exercise that kind of imperial control. Okay, so this is to give us an idea of where we are heading to next. So there's going to be some bad news for the people of Eastern Europe. The Mongols are on their way, and so we here have an account written by anonymous Christian monks in Novgorod, which is located near Russia. Right, so it talks about foreigners called Tartars, the Mongols. Came in countless numbers like locusts. And so then it talks about how they had a sorceress and they demanded 1/10 of everything. And so it refers to them as pagans. So you get all of these words that are strongly negative in kind of what they're implying here, what they're conveying. And so then it talks about how they killed men, women, children, monks, nuns, priests, some by fire, some by swords, violated nuns, raped them, priests' wives, good women and girls in the presence of their mothers and sisters. And so the account here is written by people a little bit later, but from the region. And so we might view these people, these monks, as something like first-hand witnesses. So they're conveying some true information. We know that the Mongols did do things like these, but then we have clear examples of exaggeration or omission, right? They're trying to sell you on the idea that the Mongols were the destroyers of civilization in Russia. And so they bring in the devastation, the level of devastation. They omit that the Mongols tended to do this kind of thing to cities that resisted. And cities that gave in and provided the tribute that the Mongols were looking for were generally spared of this kind of thing. All right, so that brings us up to the Mongols. So if we look at the period 1200, 1450, from the Russian perspective, the big event was the conquest of much of what is now Russia and the incorporation of Russia into the Mongol Khanates. So this becomes part of the Golden Horde. And so there's been a lot of dispute historically over what this means. The Russians later on are going to accuse the Mongols of having set them back, that the Mongols devastated Russia and destroyed trade and that sort of thing. And there is some truth to that, because what happens in this period is that Russia is turned to the east, and it becomes just a vehicle for tribute to the Mongols. And so that means that the trading connections to Constantinople are disrupted to a degree, and trade with the western part of Europe is virtually cut off. But otherwise, what the Mongols do is they allow the Russians to keep their old political forms and keep their old forms of culture. The Mongols do not change religion. Russia remains Orthodox. They often didn't even change the political leaders. As long as a political leader was willing to pay tribute to the Mongols, they were allowed to stay in place. The Mongols did destroy states that resisted. Kiev famously was destroyed, and by your traditional Mongol types of tactics. The Mongols tended to have light cavalry, cavalry with soldiers that weren't wearing heavy armor. And so what they did is they drew out the heavily armored knights of Kiev, forced them to chase and chase and chase until those knights were exhausted and out of supplies, and then the Mongols just wiped them out, massacred them. The legends go that you can still find the bones of the people who were killed by the Mongols in the soil around Kiev. So Russia becomes one of the tributary zones of the Mongol Empire. And so Constantinople, meanwhile, is in decline. By the time we get to 1200, 1300, there are Mediterranean city-states that are emerging as competitors to Constantinople for trade. And the most important of those is Venice. And so Venice is going to act not according to this Christian alliance and carrying out a holy war or crusade, but according to its secular trading needs. Venice wants to eliminate Constantinople as a rival. And so the Venetians basically subvert the Fourth Crusade, which ends up sacking Constantinople. And the city of Constantinople never really recovers from that. And in addition to that, what's going to happen by the time we get to around 1400 is a new Muslim empire is on the rise in the region, and that's the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1453, the Ottomans, using gunpowder weaponry, are going to reduce the walls of Constantinople that had been able to withstand sieges before. The Byzantines famously have Greek fire, an early form of napalm, to help defend the walls. The firearms of the Ottomans are able to do the job, and Constantinople, which was a shell of its former self by 1453, is taken by the Ottomans. So 1450 then is a major breakpoint for the Eastern Europeans. Constantinople has fallen right around there. The Byzantine Empire, which had, depending on how you date it, we can date it from Constantine moving the capital, we can date it from Justinian, we can date it from the fall of Rome. But regardless of how we date it, we're looking at an empire that's lasted for close to 1,000 years, even by the latest date of the beginning of the empire. And then Russia has become part of the Mongol Empire. So in 1450, in Western Europe, that's when the Renaissance is happening. Shortly after this, the Reformation is going to occur. And we have, in 1492, Columbus sailing the ocean blue. Well, Russia's participating in none of that. They are isolated entirely. And so we're going to jump now to the Russians. So this is one of the famous events in Russian history, is from the Battle of Kulikovo. And so the depiction here is of something that is semi-historical, semi-legendary. According to at least one account, before the Battle of Kulikovo took place, both sides chose champions, and the champions were to fight, and the fight was going to determine who would win the battle. And some accounts say both of the champions killed each other, and so they kind of come across and both stab each other with spears, both fall off the horses. So it's unknown who's going to win. And then, according to some of the accounts, the Russian, who was also, according to this account, an Orthodox monk, he stabs the Mongol champion, and he's mortally wounded himself, but he's able to stay on his horse long enough to be clearly the victor. But at any rate, what happens at the Battle of Kulikovo is that the Russians win. And so it becomes clear later on that this battle was something of a turning point. The Mongols had become a little bit soft, their empire was overextended and fragmented, and so the Russians are going to be able to push them out. But it's critical to understand the source of this particular painting. It was painted in 1914. Now, what's happening in 1914? The First World War. And so this particular artist had been used by the Russian government as something of a propagandist already. And so he is using this event to fire up Russian patriotism at the beginning of this total war. And the event that we see here, the Battle of Kulikovo, what really would have happened is that one of the principalities under the Mongol rule would have rebelled at this point. But now this is portrayed as the birth of the Russian nation. And so this is an example of how nationalists who are emerging really in the 19th century are going to co-opt earlier historical events and reinterpret them in a nationalist sense. So when this happened, nobody was thinking, we're creating the Russian nation. But by the time we get to the late 19th century, now this is perceived by the romantic Russians of that time period as the birth of this Russian nation. All right, so if we jump to 1450, the Russians are pushing the Mongols back. So we have Ivan the Great, and then we have Ivan the Terrible, who are participating in that effort to push the Tsars out, or push the Mongols out. So they're creating a new form of government, which is the Tsarist form of government. The Tsarist form of government is looking back to Constantinople and to Rome for legitimacy. Because Tsar, sometimes you'll see it as C-Z-A-R, so Caesar. Caesar was from Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. It had come to mean emperor. So they're claiming that they are establishing, in a way, a new Roman Empire. And so they claimed that you had Rome, then you had the second Rome, which was Constantinople, and that Moscow is the third Rome. And so they at first are pushing the Mongols back to the east. But then as time goes on, as with other rulers, what begins to happen is that expansion becomes a way for the central ruler to exercise more control over the national government by rewarding elites with land. And so the Tsars, as they expand eastward, are able to reward Russian nobles with large estates. And the basic bargain that is struck between the Tsar and his nobles is that as long as the nobles stay out of the Tsar's way in controlling the government of Russia as a whole, the Tsar will let the nobles control their estates as they see fit. And so the nobles would be on their estates the judge, jury, and executioner. They would be the police force, they would be the investigators, they would be the court system, all rolled into one. And the peasants who worked there were reduced to serfdom as a result of this. All right, so that is happening in the late 1400s and into 1500. Then there is a civil war that brings to power a family called the Romanov family. And the first great czar of that family, maybe the greatest czar of that family, is Peter the Great, Peter the First. And I put up there the dates of his reign so that you can see how late in the early modern period this is. It's almost at the end of it. And we're going to group him together with Catherine because both of them are westernizing. So westernization is a form of modernization. What Peter the Great was attempting to do was to make Russia more powerful, make himself more powerful, by bringing in Russian ideas that would do that and rejecting, or bringing in Western ideas that would do that and rejecting the Western ideas that would potentially limit the power of the Tsar. So around the same time, England experiences the Glorious Revolution, which makes Parliament the supreme part of the English government. Peter is obviously going to reject that. There is no national legislature in Russia until 1905. So the Tsars do not want any part of a national legislature that would regulate their power. But they do want what was occurring in France at this time, which is the more efficient forms of government that resulted from French absolutism. So a bureaucracy that answers to a czar. So kind of looking around, what Peter is aware of is that Russian isolation had caused Russia to fall technologically behind, which meant militarily behind. There were diasporic communities of Western European merchants around Moscow. They had come in through a northern port called Archangel. Well, Archangel was iced over for a portion of the year. So Peter the Great needs to establish more direct trade ties with Western Europe, and he needs to bring in Western technology and ideas. And so famously, Peter begins this process by going on his embassy to the West, and he was 6'8", but he tried to go incognito under an assumed name, as if anybody would mistake this giant, bad-tempered Russian for anybody other than the Tsar. And so as he goes through the western part of Russia, or western part of Europe, what he's trying to do is bring in experts from the West. He wants to hire people who know how to build Western ships or know how to organize Western military forces. And so he kind of going from one thing to another. He goes to the Netherlands where he studies at a shipyard. While he's in the Netherlands, observes the dissection of a human body. And so he's a very curious guy, but he does not want, again, any Western ideas that could be associated with the Enlightenment to reach Russia. He wants the Tsar to be all-powerful. So this is very much then a top-down reform. He's not pulling his people to see what they want. He is forcing them to go along with his reforms. And so among his elite, this would involve some loss of power. And to think about how insulting it might be if you were a Russian military officer to be told that this foreigner from the German states was now in charge. So Peter had enough power to make that work. I mean, when he went on his embassy, there was a group of palace guards, the Streltsy, who had rebelled, and Peter came back and wiped them out. And so nobody is going to go against Peter directly. What they begin to talk about doing is reversing his reforms once he dies. And so when Peter gets wind of that, his son was part of this plot. He has his son arrested and tortured to death, and he might have taken part in that torture himself. And he's the great, right? And not the terrible, the great. So Peter the Great is able to jumpstart Russian modernization. By the end of Peter's reign, Russia's military looks like a Western European military. They had defeated Sweden, which had maybe the most efficient military in all of Europe at this time, which gave Peter control of the land where St. Petersburg was built as his window to the West, establishing stronger connections to Western Europe. And so the Russians in this time period are very much seeing themselves as part of Europe, even though they controlled a lot of Asian territory. Peter the Great was trying to position the Russians as more like Europeans. And so you can see in that top middle portrait of Peter, he's dressed in what he labeled as the French fashions, Western European fashions. If you look at the portrait on the far right, that's Ivan the Terrible. He's dressed in the earlier robes, which Peter considered to be Asiatic and examples of superstition. So you couldn't wear those robes if you were a noble, and you couldn't have that kind of beard if you were a noble. Unless you wanted to pay the beard tax, you had to shave your beard. And so we see again a lot of cultural imitation then, while not changing Orthodox Christianity. But what we see in Peter the Great's reign, compared to earlier Russian imitation of the Byzantines, is a good deal more transformation of the political system. But unlike Peter, or unlike Louis XIV of France, Peter does not have a large middle class to draw upon to replace nobles in the bureaucracy. So once again, his deal with the nobles is, if you serve in my bureaucracy and you allow me to do what I want to do in the central government, you can do whatever you want with the serfs. You can treat your peasants however you like. I will give you a free hand. And so in Russia at this point, coercive labor becomes even more coercive. Slavery becomes more, or serfdom becomes more like slavery. Westernization is continued a little bit later on by Catherine the Great, who was not even Russian. She was a German princess who had overthrown her husband, Peter III, and usurped the throne. And she was considered to be an enlightened absolute monarch. Enlightened in this sense meant that the monarch would try to act in more efficient ways, more rational ways. So Catherine the Great took steps to try to reduce the use of torture and treat serfs in a more humane way, tried to organize the Russian laws a little bit better, organize the bureaucracy a little bit better, and so she does do that. That's the element of Westernization. By the end of her reign, so you can see 1796, almost 1800, modern era, that's when the French Revolution is going on. At the end of her reign, Russia will have a first-rate European-style military. They will be instrumental in the defeat of Napoleon. So in that way, the Russians have become more modern. And they reached this state by engaging in mercantilist policies that have been modified in kind of a unique way. So remember, in mercantilism, the whole goal was to manufacture as many goods as you could. And so often that was accomplished in Western Europe by getting the merchants to pool their wealth in joint stock companies and to fund this kind of manufacturing. Well, Russia doesn't have much in the way of a middle class because they hadn't traded all that much. So instead, what you have are the state is going to organize these factories to make weapons and make steel, and they're going to use serfs as the workers. And that tends to work pretty well with military industrialization. But outside of that kind of industrialization, outside of military manufacturing, the Russians are still far, far behind Western Europe or China or India. They were not known for their production of things like cotton cloth or silk or ceramics. They were known at this point for production of things like furs and other types of raw materials like timber. So as a result, during this time period when trade is booming, Russia is a raw material producing zone that is producing more raw materials and maximizing the profit that nobles receive through the sale of those raw materials through the use of a particularly repressive form of serfdom. So coercive labor in Russia becomes more coercive during this time. And the Russians at the top, people like Catherine, they knew this was a ticking time bomb. The serfs eventually who would rebel, and they made up the majority of the population. And Catherine fought a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire successfully. But during one of these wars, there was a massive peasant uprising led by the person in the bottom right, Pugachev. Now, Pugachev was a former serf who claimed that he was Peter III, the husband of Catherine the Great. Catherine had imprisoned Peter III, and he had been killed. But remember, most people would not have known what he looked like. So Pugachev says, I'm Peter III. I was off on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and while there, I had an epiphany that I should free all the serfs. And so he comes back to Russia and says, I'm back, and I'm freeing the serfs. A really, really popular message. It leads to a massive uprising that for a while is successful. But as happens so often with these things, eventually it fragments. Catherine is able to get enough of her military force back from the Middle East in order to crush Pugachev's rebellion. But this is kind of an example of the Russian patterns we're going to see. The Russians respond to demands for reform with repression. And so the pattern is going to happen again and again and again. And you can be successful as a ruler in doing that as long as you have the instruments to repress people. So if, for instance, you send away your army to fight a total war, you might be a little bit less able to repress your population. And bad things could happen for you, the Tsar, if that occurred. Okay, so another typical pattern we see with Russia is that there tends to be a burst of activity in order to catch up and modernize, as we see under Catherine and earlier under Peter. And so the Russians at this point have become as powerful militarily as the West without changing their fundamental political institutions, the Tsarist autocracy. And so when the French Revolution breaks out in Western Europe, and you have revolutions in 1789, and then you have Napoleon, and then Napoleon's defeated by the Russians in 1812, and then you have subsequent revolutions in Western Europe that don't happen in Russia, the Russians are almost going to break their arms, patting themselves on the back about how awesome they are, that they have a system that works, and the Western Europeans have a broken system that results in revolutions. And so as a result of that, over the first half of the 19th century, the Russians are not going to industrialize. They're going to continue to rely on primitive, serf-based agriculture. And so for a while, again, that's kind of hidden. The Russians still appear to be powerful. Look at all the territory they control. Mostly they were fighting the Ottomans, and compared to the Ottomans, the Russian army was very technologically advanced. But in 1853, a conflict is going to break out first with the Ottoman Empire, but then in order to prevent the Russians from partitioning that empire, Britain and France are going to join the war against Russia on the side of the Ottomans. Britain and France by 1853 had industrialized a fair amount. Now, we're not yet to the point where you have ironclad ships and you have machine guns, not quite yet. But at this point, the Russians were still building their naval vessels along earlier patterns, and the British had begun to use these harder woods. And so the Russian cannon, for the most part, could not even penetrate the hulls of the British ships. They just bounced off, the cannonball did. Meanwhile, the British have these industrialized artillery pieces that are just blowing the Russian ships apart. And the other example of the gap is the European rifles. So at this point, the French had developed the Meunier ball, which is the bullet. It was not the old round ball, but the aerodynamically shaped bullet. And so the French soldiers with their rifles could hit Russian soldiers with accuracy between 800 and 1,000 yards. So that's 10 football fields away. Meanwhile, the Russians were still using muskets, and they had to close to about 200 yards to be accurate. And so the Russians lose this war essentially, fought in their own backyard in the Crimean Peninsula. And this is a wake-up call. The Russians realize that it's because they haven't industrialized that they have fallen behind. And so this is what starts a new burst of activity to try to catch up. And so the Russians realize we need to get rid of serfdom, because serfdom is holding us back. If people are trapped on estates and they can't move to cities and they can't go to factories, so they abolish serfdom, and we engage in this burst of what could be considered state-sponsored industrialization. State-sponsored industrialization is not the same as state-controlled industrialization. So in the 1930s, Stalin is going to institute his 5-year plans, where the government is going to, in theory, control all the factories and be responsible for all industrial production. This is not that. What we're saying instead is the state is helping to allocate resources and funnel investment into certain areas, mainly things like railway construction, because it was recognized that railway construction was going to have military applications. So the great example of the success of Russian industrialization is the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, with state subsidies and state guidance, but a lot of private and even foreign investment as well. And so the Russians were catching up. The growth rates were pretty substantial, but they had not changed the condition of the serfs enough to industrialize fully. And remember that if you want a full-blown system of industrialization, what you also need is a really good education system. And you need to allow people to come up with new ideas. Well, you have a secret police force silencing people who dissent. That's not going to work so well. The peasants who have been freed still couldn't move from the village until they paid back the noble for their freedom. And these were called redemption payments. And so the industrialization remains slow. And so the contrast we made earlier in the course was to Japan. Japan makes far more fundamental changes to its society. And so industrialization in Japan tends to reach a higher level. And so the Japanese are able to defeat the Russians then in a conflict. So kind of the bigger picture here is that the Russians have industrialized and changed economically, to a large degree changed militarily, but they have not changed their social system, which remained essentially feudal. And they had not yet opened the door for the members of the middle class who were becoming wealthier as a result of industrialization and demanded more of a say. And so kind of the larger European picture is that in 1848, there were a series of revolutions. They didn't occur in Russia, but they did in parts of Eastern Europe. And those revolutions were unsuccessful. And so that is going to lead to a change in mindset. And the change in mindset among reformers is that nice speeches and protests are not going to be enough, especially against regimes like the Russian regime that's willing to use force against reformers. What you need is to match violence with violence. And so reforms don't work, uprisings are suppressed, so what people resort to is terrorism. And so we see two groups in particular participating in that kind of political terrorism, Marxists and anarchists. And they begin to target political officials throughout Russia and use firearms and bombs to assassinate Tsarist officials. And so there's this extremism that's building up. And what's the Russian government's response? Repression. Repression, repression, repression. And so ultimately we're going to reach a point in 1914 where the pot is boiling, and the Russian Tsars have been able to hold the lid down on this boiling pot using their army. But when they send the army away to fight the Germans, and the Germans defeat that army, and people begin to withdraw their loyalty, the whole system is going to become unraveled. But in the 19th century, we already see signs of this. And so this is one example of that. Okay, so here we have, as a source, a Russian police chief. He was with Alexander II. Alexander II had actually survived an assassination attempt already on his train car. And so here, the assassination attempt is successful. It's carried out by a revolutionary group. And Alexander II would call it a terrorist group, the People's Will, that was able to take him out with the second of 2 bombs. And so you can see the scene there. His Majesty was half lying, half sitting, thinking he was merely wounded. I tried to lift him, but the Tsar's legs were shattered and the blood poured out of them. And so if we're using this as evidence of the resistance to this kind of regime, then that's where we would pull the information about the assassination as evidence. But if we're sorting this, a really useful approach can be not to take the perspective or the purpose of the author. And we know he was there, and we know that what he's trying to do is make it seem like this lawless organization was a terrorist organization. He talks about how you have 20 people with wounds of varying degrees. So he's playing up the terrorist nature of the People's Will. But what can be really useful is to look at the context. And we could say that in 1881, when the Tsarist regime had been repressing, and you had the development of Marxist organizations like the one that will ultimately be led by Lenin, and the formation of groups like the People's Will, that this was the outcome. People were frustrated by the lack of reform progress. They're frustrated that protests result in imprisonment. They're frustrated that uprisings have been brutally suppressed by the Russian government. And so the outcome of that is terrorism. So that brings us to the end of 1900, and we can on the verge of the collapse of this Russian state. And what we will do next is move off to East Asia and look at the developments from 1200 to 1900 in China.